Hello and welcome to another guided reading on the new Acropolis channel. Today we will talk about this book, The Sacred and the Profane by Mircea Eliade. I will be following the edition by Martins Ponte Publishers, which is this one here, but that does not mean you cannot follow along with the edition you have. The book has 4 chapters. We will cover 1 chapter per lecture. Do not forget, it is important that you also follow along by reading, not just by watching the lectures. In the lectures, I will summarize the main points and provide commentary. But it is very important that you follow along with the reading. Well, first of all, who is Mircea Eliade? Mircea Eliade was born in 1907 in Romania, therefore he was Romanian, and he passed away in 1986. So, he lived for 79 years. He passed away in Chicago, United States. He became a naturalized citizen, American. A quite interesting life, as he was always seeking wisdom, a very special figure. Even at a young age, he already mastered 8 languages perfectly. He lived in India to better understand the structure of Eastern religions. He had an academic background in philosophy, but became self-taught in the history of religions. He did very interesting work in the comparison of religions. Trying to find the common elements, he himself emphasized that he knew religions were greatly influenced by cultural and historical contexts. However, what was of particular interest in this book were those common elements that lie behind the phenomenon of the sacred. He will focus a lot, especially, on the concept of the sacred and what he calls hierophany. This concept is reiterated throughout this book. What is hierophany? Hierophany? The manifestation of the sacred in the world. He works a lot with this idea. He says that if the sacred did not manifest from time to time, humans would have no way of being aware of it. Remember that we have already talked about the theory of Oriental impact. Consciousness is born from contrast. Between silence and sound, we perceive the sound. Between one color and another, we perceive both. If the entire world had only one color, or sounded a single musical note all the time, without contrast, we wouldn't have consciousness. So, he says that the appearances of the sacred in the history of humanity, especially in ancient man, what he called the homo religiosus, give us a sense of what the sacred is and its importance in life. Of the appearance, the manifestation of the sacred in the concrete world, which is what he calls hierophany. Therefore, we are going to talk a little bit about the main ideas of this first chapter. The general ideas that all religions have, which allow the manifestation of the sacred in the concrete world. He starts by talking about the ancient man, homo religiosus, like he calls it. Moreover, he said that this man had a psychological need to be close to the sacred, to be close to reality. It was believed that the world is only real when it is illuminated by a metaphysical reason for being. A reason for being that comes from the heavens, a bridge between heaven and earth. What is illuminated by this celestial element has reality, the rest is illusion. In other words, this man had a need from which he drew his confidence, his sense of reality, his strength, his power, a series of attributes that were given to life when it was considered that the space had been illuminated, had been awakened by the sacred. Eliade has a way of speaking that is very beautiful and very special, where he says that the sacred establishes the world. Therefore, imagine that you have a chaotic nature without any guidance, without any arrangement, and without any meaning. Things are simply given without any explanation. From the moment you project the idea of the sacred onto the concrete world, you give the world direction. The purpose of the world is to cross this bridge and reach the sacred, to reach sacred ideas. Therefore, this point where you illuminate through the sacred becomes an axis, a reference point. Life starts to have meaning. He is going to make a comparison with current life. The modern man, whom he says is completely without a center, in other words, discentered, disoriented, because there is no orient, no marking that gives him a reference to be able to signal his world, to give the coordinates of his world, to provide the basic points of his world. In other words, man finds himself lost. So, he will reiterate several elements of the life of this ancient man, Homo religiosus, who, for him, is the true threshold between the animal and the human. It is not Homo sapiens, because a bit of this mastery over things, a bit of this technology of manipulating things, to be able to achieve results, we find it in certain animal species. But this perception of the metaphysical is exclusive to humans. So, it's as if man is not the one who uses reason, but the one who understands that this world reflects something that is not here. Therefore, the first man actually is the one who kneels before the metaphysical. He recognizes this world illuminated by something beyond. He says some things that are very interesting and very beautiful, which actually are very reminiscent of Confucius, with all those protocols and that order in life. In fact, it reminds us of various traditions. He will say that this ancient man, the Homo religiosus, everything in his life. He was Socratic. In other words, the city where he lived, his house, the utensils, the tools. He himself has a book called The Forge and the Crucible, where he talks about how important it was, important for these men. In addition, these mythical blacksmiths, these blacksmiths associated with alchemy, talked about how each tool was sacred, how each tool was an extension of their powers to shape life. So, the city was sacred, the house was sacred. Their tools, their utensils were sacred. Their work was entirely dedicated to creating something similar to what the gods created at the beginning of the world. That is, to add value to the world. Their work was not simply to gain reward, but to assist nature in the construction of the world. It was to add value, therefore it was sacred. And also things that we consider basic in life. Like food, sexuality, everything was a sacrament. So, food nourishes the body. We will see that, for the ancient man, based on books like The Ancient City, as well as the Analects of Confucius and others, food, the gathering of people who make up a family around a table. Food is a ceremony, it is a sacrament, as he says. It nourishes not only the body, but also the soul. When food is a sacrament, there is no gluttony, there is no excess. Everything is done within a harmony, and there exists an environment that nourishes not just the body. It is a point of conjunction. It is a point of union for all those who dwell in that house. Sexuality, which is associated with the union of opposites, harmony through opposition, everything has a meaning. Life no longer has randomness, life has sacraments. So, any act that would simply satisfy the needs of the body begins to nourish the needs of the body, the psyche, and the spirit. It begins to fulfill man in three worlds. In other words, everything that is done ceremonially. It's like if you imagined it there, including an interesting maxim that is used in alchemy. They used to say that anything that cannot be Socratic is a sign that it should not be done. Stop to imagine this idea. Anything I am doing, I stop. Could I do this in the name of? In the name of humanity. In the name of God. In the name of my city. In the name of something I want to benefit. This, no matter how simple it may be, I'm sweeping the floor, can be done in the name of that. Yes, it can. I am purifying my space with the intention of purifying myself and with the intention of bringing more purity to the world. Great. This is moral. That which adds no value, neither to you nor to the world, cannot be Socratic. It's a sign that it shouldn't be done. All of this is within these protocols. Of these canons of the religious man, where his life was entirely guided by the idea of the sacred. Everything had the intention of hierophany. And this was the practice of some, but the intention of many in the past. So, you will see that Egypt itself was like this, a city like Thebes, where there wasn't really a word for religion. All acts of life were consecrated. In such a way that it was said, "Blessed is the one who is born in Thebes, blessed is the one who dies in Thebes." Because living there, Every act had the opportunity to have meaning, to be educational, to be informative, to be a consecration of man's life to something greater than life itself. He will continue to say that the sacred space is real. The other is shapeless and illusory. Let me try to explain this to you in a way that's a bit more understandable. I use this example a lot in my classes. Imagine that you are someone who decided to start saving. I will now contain my expenses because I'm overspending too much. But I am a great collector of antique porcelains. Let's say, on the day I started saving, while passing by a store, I found that Chinese vase of my dreams that I've always dreamed of having in my collection. At that moment, that vase is the most real thing in the world because it represents proof for me. Let's say I can't resist the temptation and buy that vase. It becomes a novelty in my home. Look at the acquisition made. Tomorrow I start saving. You realize that, regardless of the outcome. From this proof, whether you buy it or not, from that moment on, the vase, which is a temporary object, starts fading into the background of life. Let's say you buy it and place it right in the middle of your living room. It's the latest novelty. But let's be honest, since you faltered in a test, it's likely that this won't be the last indulgence you make. Tomorrow you'll buy something else. And that vase, which was the focus, the latest novelty, becomes the second to last and gets moved to a corner. And soon enough, the third to last gets moved to another room. One fine day, someone hits it with a broom, breaks it, sweeps up the shards, throws it in the trash, and you don't even miss it. Oh. It faded away, turning to dust. Think about it. Maybe it was always just dust. The reality of that vase for you was the opportunity it gave you to strengthen, or not, your willpower. Behind objects, there are tests. There is a meaning. The entire universe is opportune, an opportunity for the expansion of consciousness, self-mastery, self-transformation, and things hold more value as symbols than as utilitarian physical objects. So, he says that the intention of the Homo religiosus was for his entire life to be a hierophany, for everything to be consecrated. That everything served the betterment of man, the betterment of society, the fulfillment of nature's purpose. Moreover, he also goes on to say that, indeed, for ancient man, existence in the world could only happen through a contact with the heavens. Because if man doesn't have this contact with the realm of ideas, Platonic with this human ideal, this ideal of all things that exist in the realm of ideas, he simply survives here, without any possibility of improvement. All improvement, whether human or of any other being, depends on a celestial model, an ideal. As the Stoic philosopher Epictetus once said, the seeds of greatness in man need an image to mirror and flourish. Therefore, that is, all the time, the world of ideas, the celestial world, provides a model, provides an ideal, in order to have the transformations of the world can be guided, oriented. Without any guidance, either things in the world come to a halt, or they lose direction and can even regress from the point they needed to move forward. They can go against the flow or halt. Therefore, life is fulfilled. The world has meaning, moreover, human existence, as the human being itself, is possible from this bridge with the heavens. Notice how interesting, strong, and beautiful these ideas are, coming from a researcher with a very intriguing and unique perspective. And particularly useful for us, he continues by saying the following. A temple, a house, or anything that was consecrated within that society. In ancient times, you had a portal like a threshold, a passageway. It's no wonder there was an entire protocol. For example, in Eastern civilizations, not entering with shoes, meaning not bringing the pollution of an illusory and unreal world into a Socratic space. You enter there and you know that you are outside of ordinary time, of mundane time. There, it is a space where the laws manifest and you align yourself with them. You replenish yourself. According to Indian tradition, you fill yourself with Dharma. You realign yourself with the Dharma. You remember who you are and what you serve. So, this consecrated space is not affected by time or circumstances. There, it is illuminated by something greater than time. Therefore, it is a source of energy. That is, always a space for man to replenish his own identity. So, there was this great concern with a threshold. In Chinese civilization, we see gods placed at the doors of the house, guardians. Not only in Chinese culture, but in many others. There were guardian gods who protected this threshold between the profane space and the sacred space. You will see in Rome, this is very interesting. In the ancient city, there was the ritual of the bride not stepping on the threshold, being carried in the arms of her husband, crossing this threshold, and entering directly into this sacred space, so that she enters there as pure as possible from the influences of circumstances, as pure as possible from the dirt of the profane. From the chaos of the profane, enter this environment and become a factor in cultivating the central fire. Of the household gods, that is, of the essence, the identity of this space. There are so many things that reinforce this vision. Stop and think, in talking about Fustel de Coulanges, the ancient city, in talking about China, in talking about Egypt. It seems that everyone, in a certain sphere of time, in a context, knew that sacralization is the main function of man in the world. Notice that we have advanced a lot in technology regarding things. But about men, about the protocols of life, we no longer remember anything. Who among us finds it necessary for a space to have a center, to be sanctified? So that there be sacraments of shared meals? So that everything has a meaning, everything revolves around this center? We no longer know this. In other words, things come into our home because they match the sofa, not because they evoke our consciousness to remind us of something. They are not aids in the elevation of our consciousness. They are lifeless objects, simply coming together to create an appearance that seems pleasing to us. Today, perhaps not tomorrow. This world of the religious man was entirely imbued with meaning. In fact, according to Eliade, the sacred is the function of giving meaning. Everything serves a hierophany, that is, for human consciousness to rise to its ideal, to ascend to the divine, to reach the heavens. In other words, every consecrated space is a bridge, a corridor that connects heaven and earth. And the house of man should also be like this. He will reiterate this later on. He will say that. In the same way that Mircea Eliade fights against this. We will see that there is a contemporary philosopher who also talks about this. Mircea Eliade quotes Le Corbusier, who said that houses were machines for living in, and who found this absolutely absurd. A house is not a machine for living in. It's not something you just walk into and fulfill your physical needs. It's not something you can be just anywhere. That it doesn't matter. A house is a home for a human being. In other words, they're all the coordinates. Everything is aligned in a way to remind him of who he is. Nothing is random, nothing is chaotic. The difference between a house and a home is precisely this capacity for hierophany. It's a space, completely distinct. In a certain way, we still remember this. And he talks about this, inclusive. When we take a long journey, that longing for home. There comes a certain moment when a trip to the most exotic, interesting country in the world is no longer more important to us than being in our own home. We know that there is a special space there, in a certain way created for us to feel like ourselves, for us to rediscover our identity. I referred to a contemporary philosopher who is Roger Scruton. He also argues with another contemporary architect, Louis Sullivan, because Sullivan said, form follows function, implying a dwelling is merely utilitarian, serving to fulfill survival and procreation instincts. But nothing, moreover, a dwelling only for the body. He says, this causes tremendous anxiety and ends up making man increasingly disoriented. In other words, a threshold between two worlds at the door of a temple. It's very similar to a threshold between two worlds that should exist within a human being's home. For it to truly be a home, a space where hierophany is realized. So, he talks a bit about traditions from various places around the world. In Rome, the household gods, the altar, the central fire, the lararium, where the spirit of the family, the guardian spirit of that family, was cultivated, was revered, a fire, a pillar, an altar. And he says that even the idea of the chimney, which is that open space where the celestial world communicates, with the terrestrial, where the vapors of the earth rise to the sky, the exhalations of the earth ascend to the heavens. If you consider a quite contemporary tradition, which is Santa Claus entering through the chimney, even that is connected. The entrance of Santa Claus, who is that gentleman, the Ancient of Days, dressed in red amidst the snow of times, be that messenger who gifts us with the reminder that it is the moment to be born. Christmas. It is the moment to be reborn. Even that is connected to this idea of the center in a home. The referential center, the pillar that guides our life. So, everything refers back to this center. And this center has some connection with the sky. Whether it's an altar, a ceremonial fire, or an opening to the sky, there is a meeting point. You'll notice that in some cathedrals, there's even a spire. In fact, it's a very interesting thing, the symbolism of cathedrals, especially the Gothic ones. There was a spire that represented something like the navel of the world, connecting this earthly world with the celestial. Continuing on, he will say that some other remnants we see nowadays, for example, is that strong feeling we have when we return to our homeland. We know that it is not just any place. There is a kind of consecration of that place where we came into the world, where we lived our childhood. Where do we hold our memories? Pure. Or that place where we experienced our first love. We know it is not an ordinary place. It has something special, some value that connects us to very elevated elements. The purity, the desire to give of oneself, this need to be with others. These moments of our lives are imbued in that place, that they hold a sacred character for us, so that we no longer know how to build this, and they are rare. But internally, we never stop knowing that spaces must be consecrated, so that they help us grow, so that we don't get lost in life. So, continuing, he will talk about the ancient man who always has a nostalgia for the divine and seeks to reconnect with it by orienting his world, giving life, giving birth to his world. Remember, the sacred establishes the world. A very common example I often give in my lectures. I ask, am I walking in the right or wrong direction at this moment? You can't tell me if I'm right or wrong because you don't know where I'm going to end up. If I tell you, I want to reach the wall, now you can tell me, that's right. Now it's wrong. Notice that I have a point of reference to measure my actions. Right or wrong? Good or bad? If this point of reference doesn't exist, what is right? What is wrong? What is good? What is bad? And this point, this reference of orientation for the ancient man, was the idea of the center. The center of your consecrated home, the center of a consecrated temple. Moreover, you knew that things were human, that your life was being human, worthy of a human being, when it revolved around this center, without losing sight of it. In other words, the center cast its points, its coordinates, and you gravitated among them without losing sight of the consecration of life. Then you were living a human life. Without this center, without this reference, what do we live for? What is our purpose? Where are we headed? Man gets lost. Therefore, that is, profane life is a disoriented life, where values become a matter of personal opinion, and not of reference. There is no metaphysical connection. Therefore, man's reason is a reason that serves only the instincts. And, as Immanuel Kant said, when we only cater to our instincts, reason hinders more than it helps. We become more harmful to nature than an animal does while seeking the same thing. You will hardly see an animal, in its quest for survival, damaging nature the way we do. To seek only survival and procreation, instincts would be enough. Reason only makes sense in human life when it is directed towards something higher. Then it starts to become a factor of addition. Otherwise, it creates a very dangerous predator, leaving the earth devastated in its wake. While the idea of man was to leave light in his path. Well, continuing. He says that man is sacred. So, the homo religiosus he seeks throughout his entire life surrounds this Socratic axis, this hierophany, because he wants to live a life that has essence and reality. Whereas contemporary man lives a life that is all about appearance and illusion. Merely superficial, a masquerade with no depth whatsoever. So, essence and reality versus appearance and illusion. This is a life that no longer has the markers of the metaphysical, lacks direction, lacks ideals. So, he will talk a lot, including an interesting fact, which is the scientism of our time. Science is wonderful and brings marvelous contributions. But it turns out that human immaturity leads him to want to extend the mechanical understanding of life, of the laws of nature, the understanding of oneself, and draw a bunch of conclusions that he wouldn't be equipped to make. So, the understanding of science by an immature man ends up making him want to mechanize everything, with which he turns happiness into hormones, with which he turns generosity into a hidden game of interests, in other words, a reduction of human life. It's like giving a very sharp knife to a baby. I recall in this regard a fact that left a significant impression on me. Many years ago, when I was still a novice speaker, I gave a lecture on the virtues of great men in history. And I listed some of these virtues based on certain historical figures. And a person, at the end of the lecture, raised their hand and said, "Look, everything you're talking about is an illusion. Man does not embody these virtues. Everything you're talking about." And he says a contemporary who has these virtues because those past events are mere invented stories. The human psyche cannot bear so many values like that. And, by the way, these values aren't as valuable as you're saying. Science has already proven that near a black hole, even the law of gravity is relative. Therefore, all these values you're talking about are relative. They have no reality in themselves. They are worth nothing. Well, the speech was forceful and, at the same time, impressive. Because this person was an influencer, someone with a certain social status, it was very concerning to me. And it stayed etched in my memory, because it was evidently a person who was mixing facts of a very different nature. Perhaps the law of gravity is relative in the face of a black hole. But I'm not a black hole, I'm a human being. And what if I want to test the law of gravity? Any window is generous enough for me to conduct this test. It's evident that there's only one being in the universe that can say everything is relative: the Absolute. We, who are not absolute, the things that are on the same level of relativity as us, are absolute for us. So, is human honesty an absolute for the universe, for a star? No, but I'm not a star, it is absolute for me. And to guide me in completing my human journey, this reference point is necessary. Honesty, kindness, and relativizing these things. It's a psychological game that causes chaos, not just mentally, but morally. It's very easy to intellectualize that honesty is relative until you become a victim of dishonesty. We know that this intellectualism has tragic effects in practice. In other words, there are indeed standards and reference points that lead us to the level of a full human being, of humanity. Complete. This is not relative. The story of everything being relative, I repeat, only works for the one who is absolute. We are also relative. And this misunderstanding of scientific truths leads you to create truths. Psychological, in quotes, that don't match, don't fit. You are dealing with two different worlds. So, you're trying to cut a cloud with a knife. They are two substances, they are different tools. So, this scientism, thrown into life by an immature man, has made humanity increasingly profane. And, consequently, increasingly disoriented. Notice, reflect, think about this. How many times have we applied inadequate tools? Because we no longer know the tools to deal with human reality. We lack reflection, we lack the capacity for self-knowledge, for self-transformation, we lack the ability to realize our hierophany, to establish an axis that gives us a reference point for direction. Continuing, he will talk about this central point, this idea of the center and how it has been important throughout history. Remember that Eliade was a historian of religions, a scholar of comparative religions, one of the most skilled of our recent times, of our recent history. A truly admirable figure, and he makes a comparison with very broad examples in the book. Here, I'm going to simplify things, otherwise we'd be here just citing examples. But he is rich in examples in the book for everything he asserts. So, he will say that the central point is a reference for the creation of the world. First of all, any human construction repeats the original act of creation of the world by God, or by the gods, depending on the tradition. In other words, when man creates, he repeats the cosmogony. And he says that cosmogony, the creation of the world, was born from establishing a central point. This central axis, around which all things are organized. This point of reality, this point of enlightenment. Like a lighthouse in the middle of an ocean. The idea of the center, we know, is very strong in nature. And our supercluster of galaxies has a center. What is the Virgo galaxy? Our galaxy has a center. Our solar system has a center, an atom, a cell. Everything gravitates around a center. Even our body gravitates around our center heart. All of this reproduces, nature reproduces this initial moment of the universe, where a point is established and the entire universe organizes itself in relation to it. It's no wonder that Plato said the circle is the most perfect of shapes, because everything is equally served by the center. That the origin, the justification, is what gives reference to all things, what gives identity to all things. Therefore, this need to establish a center has always been what marked, for example, the founding of a city. You arrive in a city, for example, at the beginning of the Banderantes, who reach a new land. They arrive, plant a cross, and hold a mass, and the city radiates around this point, which in the future will become a main church. Cities radiate around this central point. This axis that illuminates, justifies, and gives meaning to the transformation of that space. It's almost like an authorization to alter nature, to transform it into a human space. So, the same thing applies to a house, and the same thing applies to a person psychologically. Within oneself, there would be an axis of values, of virtues, around which one's entire life would be oriented. If he is a true human being, and the organization of his spaces reflects that. He will talk, for example, about the boundaries, as we mentioned earlier, that both temples, houses, and cities had a wall, sometimes with guardians. It was the boundary between the profane and the sacred. He further says that these walls surrounding the cities were more to protect against these forces of dissolution, from these forces of chaos, rather than to defend against human armies. They believed that when a city, when a land was consecrated, it was illuminated by its protocols. It was a sacrament being performed there. It was a civilization illuminated by celestial laws. This city was protected, it was in harmony. And it's very difficult for someone to penetrate something that is harmonious, that has no grooves, no cracks of disharmony. In general, the enemy penetrates through the cracks of division that exist in what it intends to infiltrate. Giving a very concrete example, it is said that Napoleon, for instance, enters Spain with the support he receives from within. He invades countries because there are cracks within, and he allies himself with them. Something that is compact cannot be penetrated by the enemy. So, the concern with the walls was more about keeping the forces of dissolution and profane chaos on the outside than actual human enemies. They used to say that if you keep the profane out, no one can penetrate. You have a fortress here, no one can penetrate the sacred. Something interesting in the history of America that we can mention to reinforce this. Perhaps some have already heard when Cortez invades Central America, and Montezuma learns of his arrival, that Aztec civilization was already very decadent, disordered, and Montezuma feels guilty when he hears that someone is approaching. And he sends word to this invader, whom he believed to be a god, whom he believed to be Quetzal himself, asking him not to enter. No, because it was not a good time. And he sends him a shipment of gold, which will make Cortés feel even more encouraged to invade. That is, Cortés catches Montezuma at the moment of the land's desecration, and this weakens him. This exposes him. He surrenders before being attacked. He shows the riches he possesses. If there had been a Montezuma ceremonially governing his land, if there had been a hierophany, the doors would have been sealed. It's very difficult to enter a body. When the sacred has grooves of low humanity, of physical problems, it becomes much easier for an invader to penetrate. So, the walls were more about limiting the profane than about limiting military invasions. This is a very strong and interesting idea. That would allow us to reflect a lot on our own vulnerabilities. The samurais themselves, when they were wounded by a sword in their battles, they would say it is the breach of unconsciousness. It's where the sword's edge cuts. This point where it penetrated showed that inside there was disharmony. Therefore, they thanked the sword for alerting them to the disharmony. They were not fully consecrated. There was no harmony, there was no hierophany. And then the external enemies penetrate. Well, he will also say about the sacred place. This is very interesting, he says in India. When a city was to be created, or when a house was to be built, the builders would go along with an astrologer who would try to find where the head of the serpent was located. When they found the head of the serpent, they would drive a stake there, as if to subdue the serpent's head. And from there, the construction would begin, whether it was a house or of a city, an urban area. Understand this idea well. The houses and temples were always built, simulating the construction of the universe. In other words, first, you have a primordial chaos, animalistic, wild, that must be subdued. The stake over the serpent's head is like telling the animal self, calm down, be still, I'm in charge here. And from there, they would begin to build a consecrated space. In the temples themselves, he will say that there is a first. The outer courtyard, which was equivalent to this world of the serpent, this primordial chaos, placed an inner courtyard, which already represented the earth, and a holy, a sanctum, an altar, which represented fire. It represented the harmony of all worlds, the animal world, the animal consciousness, subdued by human consciousness. In other words, the serpent's head under the human's foot. Human consciousness reigns, guided by the divine. How often do we see things like this? Thus, Marduk subdues Tiamat, just as dragons are subdued, like Forgan, for example, the Celtic king, subdues dragons to build his castle. How many myths exist about subduing the serpent's head to begin a construction there? In other words, the first step to consecrate a space is to subdue the animal's self and start building something based on human values that are not merely survival and perpetuation of the species. He continues talking about the pillar. This is very interesting. This idea of the axis mundi or pillar, which in temples, sometimes in churches, is represented by the spire, by that central needle. It is very common in the traditions of the Celts, the Germans, the Romans, and he even mentions Indonesia. And he will tell a story about Australian Aborigines, who were the Arunta, who were nomadic tribes. Look at that, nomads, they had the need for a center. They said there was a tree, a thick tree trunk, on which their god ascended, consecrating that space for the Arunta. Since they were nomads, they carried this trunk with them everywhere they went. Wherever they arrived, they would plant the trunk there, and the land was consecrated. There it was once again the village of the Arunta. Eliade recounts that on one occasion, it was witnessed by an observer. When they planted this mast, the mast broke. It is said that the Arunta were so shocked by this, that they wandered around aimlessly, not knowing what to do, and some would sit and remain prostrate until they died. Because there was no meaning, no direction. They no longer knew how to live life if there wasn't a divine center, if there wasn't a sacred center. Notice the importance this holds in the human psyche. To feel endowed with meaning. To feel life illuminated by a greater purpose, to feel guided by this purpose. Without it, it is said that they would wander chaotically until they sat down and died. They lost their divine axis. They lost their center. Today, we too wander aimlessly. Sometimes we also start to wither away. We no longer know what we've lost. We no longer understand this idea of the axis, the divine center. Continuing, he will say that this was represented by different civilizations. This mast, this axis, is sometimes a tree, sometimes a vine, sometimes a column, sometimes a mountain. The most famous case is Mount Meru in India. All of India revolves around this sacred mountain, which is a bridge between heaven and earth. It marks this central axis around which life revolves. It's interesting because from this comes the notion of the navel of the world. How many cities throughout history considered themselves the navel of the world? Because they circled around this sacred point. Whether it was a time, a post, an axis, or a mountain. It's interesting because, like this center, it creates a connection between heaven and earth. It is the sacred mountain. Times like those of Gregorio de Matos simulated this sacred mountain. That which surrounds the mountain that unites heaven and earth is the highest place in the world. You will see the story of the flood, which is said to have covered all places on earth. Except Palestine, except Jerusalem. Why? Because it was the highest place on earth. It was a bridge between heaven and earth. So, sacred places are considered, geographically, the highest points on earth. The navel of the world, like pre-Columbian Cusco. How many cities have been the navel of the world? And they still are. So, this idea is so interesting. It is said that when a land is consecrated, remember, man does not invent a consecrated land, he discovers it. Either he dreams, or he receives signs. He discovers it, it is not he who chooses the sacred place. And when a civilization consecrates a place, considering it as the navel of the world, as the center, it often tends to be respected by many other civilizations over centuries, even for millennia. In other words, there a cathedral of a pagan civilization is built. Up there, later you built a Christian cathedral. Up there, it becomes an archaeological pyramid, as happened in Troy. One built on top of the other. Imagine, why would a city with so much space be built on top of the ruins of the previous one? One on top of the other. It is believed that here, at some point, some divine being pointed out that it is in the consecrated place. Therefore, let's not invent, let's not look for another, let's make the most of this place. In other words, the idea that a point on earth is more elevated, has been a bridge and can continue to be one. That many men used as a bridge, this opened a path, therefore, it's easier to be Socratic there. It's very common in archaeology all over the world. Archaeological pyramids, various civilizations, sometimes Christian cathedrals erected on top of pagan temples, that point is special. There is a corridor there that has already been opened by someone, there has already been communication, therefore, it is much easier for it to continue happening. See how much has been done throughout history around this theme. How recurrent this is. Continuing, then, he will talk about the temple. The temple is Imago Mundi, it is an image of the world. The temple is a miniature of the ordered universe. A point is established, a center, which is the navel of the temple, usually marked by this needle. And this time radiates many of these temples. For example, the Gothics reproduced the body of a reclining human being. It's there, that navel, that center. And all that space is ordered in such a way that it is built in the manner the gods constructed the cosmos. It is organized in the way the gods organized the cosmos, in such a way that it becomes a battery. It is a space beyond the mundane circumstances. It is outside of time. As the Romans used to say, in nihilo tempore, it was in a timeless region. And it is like a battery, in such a way that when people lose themselves, they find themselves there again. That there they find the blueprint for constructing the sacred. Moreover, they can rebuild themselves around such a center, becoming a battery that can supply identities. He will also say that it is a very interesting thing, because a temple, as an image of the world, imago mundi, and when it reproduces the cosmos, not only does it draw sustenance from the cosmos, but if the cosmos were to experience any disorder, any accident, it can return to nourish itself from this mirror. The magic matches a box of secrets where the order of the universe is kept. So, the micro feeds the macro, and the macro replenishes the micro. For instance, it mentions the moment when the tabernacle is designed and conceived by God. In every detail, before it was given to Solomon to build the temple. In other words, the idea of the temple was born at the moment the universe was constructed, manifested. It is simply the same idea reduced to the micro. So, it has a similarity that enjoys the attributes of the cosmos. Cosmos. It is a space of rupture, a break on a different level. When you enter time, you break time. Profane, the time of mere survival, and enter the space of life, a space with direction, a space imbued with meaning. Time is a place that is always in connection with the ideal. Therefore, an idealist is, in themselves, a living and moving temple, permanently in contact with their ideal. And finally, he will say that, in Rome, for example, the idea of the mundus or the square Rome. It was nothing more than that. It's not that they considered the universe to be square, but they believed that from this center, the four directions, the four cardinal points had emanated, and marked the circumference within which the world was illuminated, marked the circumference within which chaos was banished. And this was an example of every being that wants to create something. Every being that wants to be a creator places a marker, a bridge between the celestial world and the earthly world. And from there, it expands without losing sight of this center. In other words, when man is a creator, when he is in the image and likeness of the Father, does he adulterate the universe? No. He harmonizes, rearranges the universe according to a celestial model. He is not a factor of disharmony, nor of chaos. He reproduces the cosmos in the way these divine beings created it. And man only creates when he follows this celestial pattern. Otherwise, he simply throws himself and the world into disorder around him. And this makes the world entirely without reference points. The world is entirely profane, and remember what he mentioned earlier. That the religious man feels nostalgia for the divine, feels homesick, feels the need for his world to have references for his world. Have a reason, have a direction. Don't be a chaotic movement from nothing to nowhere. He feels a longing for reality, a longing for being, a longing for meaning. He longs for an efficient life, one that is illuminated and ordered according to a reference point. That it's not simply about surviving. It's true life. It makes a journey and marks the path for others to follow behind him. So, he will say that the creation of the world is a model for every human creative act. Man does not create unless he reproduces this great creative act, which is the ordering of cosmic space. Man came to bring order, first to his own internal space, then to the city, and finally to humanity. But for this, he reproduces the rules of the universe's creation, a center, an ideal axis that connects the two worlds, and everything is harmonized around this. Take a moment to reflect on this. This is just the first chapter. Reflect on the idea of hierophany, the idea of the sacred, the idea that the sacred establishes the world. The sacred redeems the world from chaos, from the protocols, from the sacraments of concrete life, so that it becomes a human life. So that we nourish more than just the physical body, so that we reproduce more than just the physical body, so that we fulfill our role as human beings. And let us be creators. We repeat the celestial world, we repeat the cosmogony, the sacred establishes the world, illuminates and rescues it from chaos, including our inner world. Think about that. Next week, we'll continue. Thank you.